Okay, so this week we'll be continuing a concept that we talked about last week, right? We're in the second parak of Yevamot. And last week we talked about this concept called Kedushot Shniot, that the rabbis instituted additional arayot on top of the arayot that the Torah gives. You know, the example we gave is your grandmother, which isn't explicitly prohibited by the Torah, but the rabbis say, okay, that's forbidden. So we spoke last week about, we spoke about the Kedushot Shniot last week and why it's referred to as Kedushot from Kedusha. Now we're going to look at the hint for this concept that you should have something like Kedushot at all. And we'll see a parable that Rav Ashi brings and the Gemara's response to that parable, which is an interesting one. And then how the Iyun Yaakov tries to salvage Rav Ashi's parable because the Gemara rejects it. So let's take a look. Let's get started. So Amar Rava Remez l'shniot min haTorah minayin. So, right, the rabbis they make a decree. They say there's additional arayot that are forbidden, and so Rava wants to know: do we have a hint to this concept in the Torah? Right, not that it's d'oraita. The whole point of shniot is that it's not d'oraita; it's d'Rabbanan. But Chazal like to find an asmachta, right, a kind of a support or a hint to what they're doing in the Torah. So Rava asks, where do we have a hint to this concept? And then a few answers are brought by the Gemara. And then Rabbi Oshaya comes along and he quotes a pasuk from Mishlei. And he says, Rabbi Oshaya Amar. Okay, let me make the screen a bit bigger. 1 second. There we go. Okay, Rabbi Oshaya Amar Mehacha. Okay, Mishlei Perik Daled Pasuk Tedvav. Pra'eu al ta'avor bo, ste me'alav va'avor. Okay, so this is a pasuk in Mishlei, which means avoid it, do not pass through it, and then move to the side, and then keep going. Something in the effect of, do what you can to not to go into this thing, but go around it. So, what does that have to do with a remez for the shniot? Right? What does that mean? So, Rashi says, it's actually a play on words. Rashi says, pra'ehu, so Pra'ehu, the pshat means to avoid, but Rashi interprets it from higdiluhu, like make it bigger, perhaps like pru'urvu, like pray. So it's not saying avoid it, don't go through it, but saying make it bigger, and through the fact you're making it bigger, you won't end up going through it. Right? Move to the side and then keep going. So agdileu le'isur, so make the prohibition larger, ve'osif alav kadei shelo ta'avor bo, so that you don't. And it doesn't mean al ta'avorbo, don't pass through it, but it means don't violate, like avera, right? So if you make it bigger, then you will not end up violating it. That's kind of the way that Rabbi Yoshai is midrashically interpreting this pasuk. And so the idea there is that, that even though this pasuk isn't talking specifically about shniot, but the concept is a larger concept, around like asusi agla Torah, right? That if you enlarge the Isser and you set up a fence around what's actually prohibited, so then that will make sure that you don't violate the original Isser, because you're careful not even to violate the fence that you've created around it. So
that's funny. It like kind of goes against what Adam did. That like Rashi rips him for it with saying al tasus, like don't add on, right? Because when Adam told Chava not to, like Hashem said not to eat from the tree, and Adam told Chava not to touch the tree, and then and Rashi says there that Adam was wrong, and he should have just told Sarah the truth, because then the snake pushed her, and she touched the tree, and it was okay, and then she ate from the tree. So I don't know, like a little bit of a stira.
You're right. But, that's a really.
I guess maybe the Rabbanim knew which laws were good to do, were okay to do shtiyot on, and which weren't.
So that's a great question. I hadn't thought of that. I mean, I'd heard that Rashi, but I didn't connect it to this, so that's a really good point. Yeah. I think it's even in Avodah Rabbi Natan, but I guess you said Rashi quotes that.
Maybe, yeah, I'm not sure where it was.
Yeah.
Maybe Rashi quoted the Midrash, maybe.
Yeah.
I'm not sure.
So I guess that's worth exploring in its own right.
Right.
If I had to guess what the answer would be, I assume there's people who address it, because it seems such an obvious question that you just raised.
Right.
Just off the cuff, kind of my thought would be that there's a difference between doing a siyag, which takes your original isser and just kind of
right.
It inflates it, versus adding an entirely new Isser to the original one. So I don't know if this even makes sense while I'm saying it, but in this case, we're saying, okay, you have all these Arayot, right? And we'll see this actually becomes relevant later on, right? So prohibiting the grandmother, it's not a separate Isser from the fact that the mother's prohibited, right? It's kind of just like an extension of the existing thing and adding a bit of offense. Versus perhaps what Adam said, where, but then again, it is kind of comparable.
Here because you could say, right, like, you could have said, don't eat an apple from the tree. Like, again, like I'm trying to find the analogy. Like, don't eat from the tree. Like he was saying, the act of eating was the issue, and he was saying the act of totally interacting with the tree was an issue. So here, like, the act of doing the maaseh is the issue, and you extend it to more people versus the act, like, I don't know, maybe that's, I don't know.
Right.
I like that kivun. It sounds like a very, good kivun.
Yeah.
For an answer.
I like the question. I think
all right.
let's follow up on it. It's a very good it's a very good question. I assume that because the concept of asus yag Torah is not an innovative idea, right? It's just shniot as an example. So I assume that that example of Adam, like everybody must ask the question on it. What about asus yag Torah?
It's like begs you to ask.
So I assume that there's Torah on it that we need to just go look. Go. All
right. Pull it.
Good question. I'll follow up on it.
Sounds good.
Great. Okay, go ahead. I think it's always open. Okay. Anyways, let's continue. Maybe if there's time at the end, I'll try to look it up quickly. But so as we were saying. So Rashi interpreted the pasuk to be kind of this explanation about how if you expand or you enlarge it, then that prevents you from being over it. But it's not really clear what that has to do with shniot in particular. Okay, that's a general nice, perhaps remez min Torah for the concept of making a fence around something. But what does that to do with shniot? So it's possible that bothered the Maharsha because his commentary adds a little bit. He says pareo al tavor bo. So he says, in other words, the pasuk before this pasuk in Mishlei, in other words, what is being referred to in the pasuk where it says don't go through it? What is it? So the previous pasuk says ba'orach rishayim, right? In the way of the wicked, do not come, right? Rather, you should avoid it. So Maharsha, for whatever reason, understands orach rishayim to be dehainu orach ha'arayot. That the way of the wicked is a riot, right? So it's not like a siyag in the general sense, but there's something more specific about the way the wicked conduct themselves, and a riot is the example of that. So therefore, to hint to shniot specifically, so that's what that's how the Maharsha perhaps tries to expand on Rashi and give a bit more grounding to the drasha. Okay, all that was introduction to Rav Ashi's mashal. Amar Rav Ashi, Mashal de Rabbi Yoshai Lamad Davar Domeh. So Rashi says, how can I understand Rabbi Yoshaya's explanation of Remez L'Shniyot Min HaTorah based on this pasuk in Mishlei? Let me give a parable. Laadam Mishamar Pardes. Okay, so you have a man who's guarding an orchard. He stands outside the orchard. Mishamro מבחוץ, כולו משתמר. So you imagine you have this orchard. So if the watchman guards outside the entrance of the orchard, so the whole orchard is guarded because no one can get in. All right. Mishamro מבפנים, שלפניו משתמר, שלאחריו אינו משתמר. But if the orchard stands on the inside, if the watchman stands somewhere on the inside of the orchard, so then anything that is in front of him is guarded because he's looking at it and making sure, even if someone comes in through the entrance, that he makes sure they don't come into the garden. But what's behind him is not guarded because it's behind him. You can't see it. So that's Rav Ashi's parable. So he doesn't explain the nimshal, but the idea being that if you have Pardes is kind of this thing that you want to protect, right? Or perhaps like the desire, right? The orchard has these fruits. Actually, it's very I should have connected this before, Brian. the Pardis of the Eitz Hadat, right? That you want to eat the fruit of the orchard. So it's comparable to wanting to violate a raya, right? So the Torah has the prohibitions of a raya. And then you have the watchman is in his parables the shniot, right? That they come and they guard the orchard. They make sure you don't even get into the orchard, so that you're not tempted to eat the fruit, right? You're not even getting inside. Right. So Rav Ashi says, right, that if you have a watchman, so then if he's outside the orchard, so he guards the whole orchard. So you need to have shniot, which have a fence around the arayot of the Torah, because it makes sure that the whole arayot is guarded. But then the Gemara says, the hadar of Ashi bedutahi. We'll see what beduta means in a minute. But it's a rejection of Rav Ashi's parable. Okay? Hatam shelfanav mi hamishtamer hacha ilav shniyot paga be'er v'gufa. What's going on with my highlighter? So the Gemara says, no, that's what Rav Ashi says isn't good. Why? Over there, in his parable with the watchman, so even if the watchman's on the inside of the orchard, right? Sorry, the highlighter here is something's going on. Okay, there we go. Where in his parable he says, if the watchman's on the inside of the orchard, so then whatever's in front of him is guarded, whatever is behind him is not guarded. And the Gemara says, but that doesn't make sense here, because if the watchman is inside of the orchard, which means, in other words, you don't have the shniot, right? Because the shniot are what's guarding outside the orchard. But if you have just inside the orchard, in other words, just the Torah prohibitions, so paga be'er bagufa, that's the isser. In other words, there's no idea that whatever's in front of the watchman is still guarded. If you don't have the shniot outside, then you are actually coming up against the arayot themselves. There's nothing being guarded in that case. It's the shniot, and that's the only protection there is. So the analogy does not hold. That's what the Gemara says. Okay, let's look at a couple of the Mefarshim here. So the Eitz Yosef says, what is beduta? Right, the Gemara said the hadar of Ashi bedutahi. What does that mean? So the Eitz Yosef says beduta. So perush shebada milibo ve'en ze emet, which means he lied in his heart, and this is not true. Kumo achodesh asher bada milibo. So this is a pasuk in Melachim Perek Yud Bet talking about Yeravam ben Nevat when he broke away from Malchut Yehuda, when he rebelled against when there was rebellion against Rechavam, and then Yeravam ben Nevat went and made the northern kingdom. So he changed the month for Sukkot, right, to the eighth month. So the Tanakh says that was the month Asher Bada Milibo. He just totally made it up. There was no foundation for him saying, here in Malchut Yisrael we're going to worship Avodah Zarah in the 8th month. It just came from his heart. It was total fiction. It was total nonsense. And so that's what the Eitz Yosef says is the meaning of beduta. That's really harsh, because you're saying that Rav Ashi's parable is beduta, that he just, it's right, it's not like Elu Velu Divrei Elokim Chaim. It's like, this is total garbage what he says. It's like
a joke.
Yeah, it's a joke. Exactly. It's like a bedicha. Exactly. It's a total joke. Like there's nothing to this. Like not even worth mentioning. The Eitz Yosef continues and says, "Baram b'bav mitzia b'daf tet amid aleph u'b'daf ein aleph amid bet u'b'bav batu daf kuf aleph amid bet u'v'menachu daf samachet amid aleph u'b'krita daf yud bet amid aleph ita beruta barish." So he notes that here we see it's beduta, but in the majority of cases where this concept comes up in Shas, it's recorded Baruta with an Eish, right? Reish and Dalet are obviously easily confused in terms of the Girsad. What does that mean? U'b'aruch Barta, Baruta, katav perish b'makom sheta'u chachamim, v'lo dibru kalacha, v'lo ratzu l'gnotam, v'lomar ta'u, el amru Baruta, klomar dat chitzoniti. So the Aruch, right, which is even much older than the Eitz Yosef, says, what is Baruta? It means when the chachamim made a mistake. Right? To me, this is shocking that this is even a concept. In other words, we talk about Chazal or infallible. Here you see Shetau Chachamim. They made a mistake. V'lo dibru kalacha. They did not speak according to halacha. But the Gemara, like the narrator of the Gemara, doesn't want to totally, totally embarrass them and share that it's total nonsense. So they use this word Baruta, which basically means, some foreign idea crept into this rabbi. So it's still totally, absolutely rejecting what he says, but not saying he's an idiot. It's just attributing it to some kind of foreign influence that crept in. Versus beduta, which is a little bit harsher, it says no, he totally made it up in his heart and that there's no truth to it at all. So that's what the bedute means here, okay? So the Iyun Yaakov says as follows, okay? So let's see the Iyun Yaakov. So he says, V'hadar Rav Ashi bedutahi. Uchedei shelo le'ashvot divrei Rav Ashi letoa gamur chas v'shalom. Efshar letaretz kavanato. So he says, we don't want to say Rav Ashi's parable is beduta, that it's just it's a joke, right? So the Iyun Yaakov says, let's try to, obviously the Gemara rejects it, and we understand the Gemara's logic, so there must be something flawed here. But let's see if we can salvage a kernel of truth from the joke, right? Every joke is a kernel of truth. Is there a kernel of truth in Rav Ashi's parable here? So the Iyun Yaakov says as follows, Demikol makom miktsato mishtamer. So he says, if you remember, right, the Rav Ashi's parable was if you have the watchman outside the orchard, so the whole thing is guarded. That makes sense. You have shniot, you guard the arayot, which is the orchard. But then Rav Ashi says, if you have the watchman inside the orchard, so then he guards what's in front and not what's behind. And the Gemara says, no, if the watchman's inside, in other words, if you don't have shniot, so there's nothing guarded. So the Iyun Yaakov says, but that's not true because mikol makom miktsato mishtamer. Even the arayot themselves have a little bit of the guarding against the arayot, right? Even the Torah itself has a little bit of guarding against the arayot in the Torah, not even the shniyot. So what does that mean? And then he gives an example. He says, "Kegon bito uvat bito, she'asur min haTorah, o bito uvat beno, uv'chiyai gavna, aval gav di'ilav shniyahi, pugea be'erva gufa, d'hainu bevat bito o bat beno." Mikol makom bebito lo היה פוגע, דלא יהיה בת ביתו כשנייה, שהוא גדר בפני ביתו. לכן גזרו רבנן שניות שלא יהיה פוגע בשום ערב וקיימלן. What does that mean? So, in order to understand that, we need to read the Sefer HaChinuch quickly. That mitzvah lo ta'aseh kuf tzadi hey is that a person is not allowed to sleep with his daughter. And then the Sefer HaChinuch points out something that's a little bit shocking. Okay, shelo legalot ervat habat. וזאת לא נתבהרה בלשון התורה, שאמר כתוב, הרבת ביתך לא תגלה. If we look in Parshat Acharemot or Parshat Kedoshim, right, there's a long, long list of arayot. Right? You can't do this person, that person, that person, and it doesn't say you can't sleep with your daughter. It lists all the other relationships kind of surrounding the daughter, but it doesn't say the daughter herself in the Torah.
Does it not say it in Vayikra when it talks about all the above? There's that whole parsha which parsha is it? Where it talks about all the above.
So it doesn't ever say you can't sleep with your daughter. It says you can't sleep with every other female relative in that kind of circle, but not the daughter herself. Go. Okay, what do you mean? Go on.
Generally, a father would not go and sleep with their daughter.
Right, but a father wouldn't go and sleep with his granddaughter either. The Torah still says that you can't do that.
Isn't there a concept of the Torah, like doesn't the Ramban say that, like, the Torah, there are some things that the Torah doesn't explicitly have to say, that, like, it's so muvan me'elav that it's usher that, like, you don't have to, like, actually say it? I feel like this would fall into that category.
Good. So I think the two of you are kind of alluding to what the Sefer Chinuch is going to say, and his sources are in the Gemara. So this is a whole halachic discussion actually in the Gemara, because the Chazal is saying, why doesn't it warn against the daughter? So the Sefer Chinuch says, "Mipnei ken lo ba'alea katuv mefarish v'vi she'en tzarich bo." There's no need to say you're not allowed to sleep with your daughter. V'kevan she'asur haTorah ben bat haben u'bat habat shehen rechokot mimena ein tzarich lomar she'asur the kal v'chomer hu. So the Sefer Chinuch says, if I'm not allowed to sleep with my daughter's daughter or my son's daughter, of course I'm not allowed to sleep with my daughter, kal v'chomer, because the granddaughter is more removed than the daughter. So of course I can't sleep with the daughter, so I know it from a kal v'chomer. I don't have to say it explicitly. It's redundant. It's extraneous. But if you actually look in the sugyas over there, they say, "Ein danin b'kal v'chomer." You're not allowed to learn out capital punishment from a kal v'chomer. Right? You have to learn out capital punishment from Gzera Shava or some other method. Halachically, Kal V'chomer, even though it makes sense misvara, it's not strong enough to put someone to death over. And here we would be saying if a person sleeps with his daughter, he has to be put to death, just like if he sleeps with a granddaughter. So the Kal V'chomer is not halachically, or the svara, like Ephraim, like you said, is not halachically strong enough. So actually the Gemara says, V'od limdu zichronan livracha migzera shava. So actually Chazal have Gzera Shava, to like a Mesorah to say it as well. Di mikal v'chomer greda havi alfinan la lo adam nidon alea. Right? The kaim alan, because it says in Sanhedrin, ein onshin min adin. Right? You're not allowed to put someone to death over kal v'chomer. So the Gemara, the sugis over there, they actually have a Gzera Shava where they say, okay, I know bat from this other place, and then fine. But so what's clear is that you can't sleep with your daughter. What's interesting is the Torah doesn't say it explicitly. What Chazal say emphatically is that it's still, and the Sefer Chinuch says it's still a mitzvah min haTorah. In other words, the Gzera Shava teaches me there's an Isser D'Oraita for a person to be intimate with his daughter, and the Torah says not to be intimate with your granddaughter, but doesn't say the daughter, which I know misvara obviously from a Kal V'chomer, and then also from the Gzera Shava that the Gemara brings. So circling back to the Ian Yaakov, so the Ian Yaakov says, well, let's take a look at what's going on here. And he says, if I take the case of a granddaughter, right, that the Torah says a person's not allowed to sleep with their granddaughter, right, for the son's daughter or the daughter's daughter, doesn't matter. They're both prohibited explicitly by the Torah, right? And we just saw in the Sefer Chinuch, based on the Gemara, that a person's not allowed to sleep with their daughter. But the Torah doesn't say the daughter explicitly, it says the granddaughter. But the granddaughter is a way for me to know that I can't sleep with the daughter, right? So what is that comparable to in a sense? It's just like how when Chazal say you can't sleep with your grandmother, it's a geder against the mother. In other words, the shniot is taking the isurim of the Torah and expanding them. So the Ian Yaakov argues the Torah itself does this in a sense, by forbidding the granddaughters as a guard against the daughter, because
it's like that degree of separation is the getter itself.
Exactly, right? If I know, and that's the whole idea of the Kal V'chomer, and why you guys said, what do you mean? It's so obvious. So the Torah doesn't even have to warn about it, so it warns about something that's further removed to say, like, okay, you're not even going to get close to the daughter, right? Because the granddaughter is forbidden. And so in a sense, the Isser of the granddaughter is a fence against the Isser of the daughter, which isn't even mentioned explicitly, but is understood. And so the Ian Yaakov says, so he says, even though if I didn't have the shniot of Chazal in this case, the erva being discussed is still an Isser min Torah, bat beno or bat bito is still forbidden by the Torah itself. Right? He wouldn't be sleeping with his daughter. And so you can kind of say the granddaughter is almost in relation to the daughter, all in a Doraita sphere, similar to how the shniot are related to all of the arayot, if that makes sense. So that's what the Ian Yaakov says. So how does that tie back to his attempt to find a kernel of truth in the B'dicha of Rav Ashi? So if you remember, what was the mashal? So the mashal was, you have a watchman standing outside the orchard. So if he stands outside the orchard, so then everything is guarded. So that we understood. That means if you have shniot, you've guarded all the arayot of the Torah. If the watchman stands inside the orchard, so some things are guarded and some things are not guarded. So the Ian Yaakov says, yeah, it's a beduta because we're talking only about the world of Deoraitas, and within the world of Deoraitas, there's nothing guarding me from violating a Deoraita. But there's the kernel of truth of that concept of guarding, in the sense that sem Deoraita arayot are guards against other Deoraita arayot, which we see as the example he brings is with the bat bito and bat beno being a guard against bito, which, again, there's no difference in those in terms of the fact they're both Deoraita and carry the same penalty, and they're both the same level of it. It's not like one is stricter than the other, but one is further away than the other, right? The bat bito is rechokot, in the words of the Sefer Chinuch, so it's almost like a guard. So then in this parable, So you have the watchman inside the orchard itself. In other words, you have the arayot of the Torah of bat bito, bat beno, is guarding against whatever's in front of it, right? And that's kol shilfanav mishtamer. So what's in front is bito. That's guarded because you're not doing bat beno or bat bito. But shalacharav eno mishtamer, which is the rest of the arayot, right? That the Torah still forbids, but none of those are now guarded because you don't have shniot to guard against the rest of them. So in that way, the Iyun Yaakov, I think, tries to find a little bit of solace, or to help Rav Ashi a little bit, even though the Iyun Yaakov isn't saying that Rav Ashi is correct, and the Gemara rejects it explicitly, because again, it's clear that it's not as though bat bito, bat beno actually is a fence against bito, because everything is forbidden on the same level, but the concept is a concept that is comparable to the concept of the shniot in terms of how it relates to all of the Dooraitas. So that's kind of this the Iyun Yaakov's insight into how we can interpret Rav Ashi's parable in a way that sheds a little bit more light on it, and then perhaps salvages it in some sense. Yeah, that's it. That's all I got. Yeah.
That was a good idea. It's like, yeah. I mean, kol kavod to the Iyun Yaakov was so torich. Oh. Sorry. Guys, I gotta go. Ron, shkoyach.
Shkoyach. No problem. Have a good night, guys.
We'll talk.
Yeah.